Welcome back to the Next Gen Prophets podcast. I am your host, mentor, and big sister, Deborah Ann Danae Felthazen. And as you can see, we are changing up. Well, at least for those of you watching this recording, we are changing up our studio again because this time we are in the house of Matt Kim. Now, for some of you, maybe you remember him being on this podcast a few weeks ago, but he is a powerful creative, a powerhouse teacher of the word, and we have come into his studio to get together and collaborate on the spirit of creativity, what it is, how do we tap into it, and why do you, as a prophetic champion, need it? So, Matt, thank you for coming back on the podcast and letting us into your studio here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited for a conversation.
I am loving this studio setup. And for those of you who are listening and even watching this recording, guys, make sure you check out his website, thecreativestudio.com. You can find that in the show notes because you guys want to be here in this environment. It is saturated in the power of God. Now, Matt, let's jump into our topic because we got already started on our pre-podcast chat and Michael had to stop us. He was like, okay, no, we did this last time and we missed out on a whole bunch of huge downloads. You're going to record and jump into today's session.
Yes.
So talking about the spirit of creativity, what is this spirit of creativity and how does it differentiate from just being creative?
Yeah, I think when it comes to any spirit, our relationship with any spirit is that the spirit is a source. So what we want to do as sons of God is we want to tap into the source that precedes any source, which is God the Father. And so I think our relationship with the spirit of creativity is actually the source that animates and gives life to our creativity, which is just our ability to be creative. And so just because we have the ability to be creative doesn't mean that it's sourced from or it's like breathed into by the spirit of creativity.
Yeah. Because I mean, you're seeing a bunch of powerful creatives throughout the world, and not necessarily all of them are prophets, teachers, or Christians in general. You're seeing creatives in all kinds of cultures, all different religions and denominations. So where's this switch that takes place? Especially, I'd love to hear your story. When did you realize that your natural creativity wasn't enough and you needed a supernatural impartation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my biggest creative endeavor in my life has been creating the life that God has for me with God.
Oh, come on.
Beyond the business, beyond my relationships, it's like the whole package. It's what God has put me on this earth to do, is to live out my life according to his will. And that requires a lot of creativity.
Yeah.
And so for me, part of my story was that I began to kind of cast vision for what I wanted my life to look like before Christ.
Very interesting.
And when I came into the kingdom, he completely took over that process and we had to run it back. And do it with God, with him as the source. And so for me, I was fortunate enough for the Lord to really meet me and kind of catch me early in the process. But it was a world of difference because even when I was casting vision at that early age of being in middle school, which is kind of weird and crazy to think
about. Yeah, that's a bit young to start looking at your future in that way.
But it was a world of difference because at the time I was like clinically depressed. I was like suicidal and I was just trying my best to gnaw out of this pit. And the marked difference was that when I came into the kingdom, everything that motivated me was the spirit of life, which is a spirit of creativity.
Ooh, that's good.
Yeah. And so, that was kind of the big difference for me, was that before Jesus, it was my dread of death or dread of the fruits of sin. That's what motivated me. That was my source. But when I came into the kingdom of God, it became me wanting to express the fullness of God's life. And so it's such a different paradigm. One is I'm running away from brokenness. The other one is I'm running from a place of being fully alive.
Well, let's go back there a little bit. We keep saying the spirit of creativity, but you said this one line here. It was the spirit of life where creativity lies. I want to go there a little bit because when we're talking about depression, when we're talking about facing all of that weight that comes on you, because Next Gen Prophets, he's not the only one who's ever faced that form of depression. At one point or another in our lives, we realize we're different. We realize we don't match up to our peers. We're lost in our fantasy worlds. We've got big mouths. We say things we shouldn't, and we just see life differently. And the rejection comes on you, and you face that depression. You face that rejection day after day. So that would have been a really dark moment. When was that transition point from really, I know you said it's after you came into the kingdom, but there would have been a point where you had an encounter with the Spirit of life.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, the big encounter was my senior year of high school. And so that's when one of my buddies invited me to a worship service. And at the time I was, I was saved, but I was like a Presbyterian believer. And so I was really heady, really theological. I was still kind of operating in a let me do things for God paradigm versus having a relationship with God. And so when I had that encounter with God at this worship service, it changed my life because God became substance. He became a person and not just a idea or a theory. And so I don't know. Did I answer that question?
Well, I'd love for you to share what this encounter was, because I know there's a couple of our Next Gen Prophets who are listening, and they're searching for this encounter, and they're looking for something specific. I can see you. I feel you in the spirit. You're yanking on your big sis over here, and they're wanting to know, what does this encounter look like? What does it feel like? What makes it different from any other encounter that you would have with the Holy Spirit or with the Lord Jesus?
Yeah. So, I mean, I could share a little bit about the encounter, and I'd love to like highlight certain points that I think would be really helpful. And so, I mean, first of all, on my drive over, I mean, my friend, when he invited me to this worship service, he's like, he tried his best to kind of prepare me because he knew kind of where I stood, and he had already had an encounter with the Lord. And so he's like, yeah, it's a, pretty charismatic service. They pray in tongues and they're really loud and worship. And I'm like, okay, like, I mean,
that's not bad.
yeah,
Okay.
I mean, teach their own. And so I remember on my drive there, I was praying to God, and I was like, God, like, I don't really have a theology for this yet. I haven't even like looked into this. I know that there's people that believe in this, but I'm just kind of neutral at this point. But regardless of that, I know this is a worship service. And so I'm going here to worship you. And so if I could, by the end of today, have worshiped you with everything I have, then I would feel really good about this. And so that was my one intent.
Yeah.
And so when I walked in the building, it was fascinating because I'm like, I had never felt the presence of God like that, like the tangible presence of God. And so it felt like I was walking into a pile of blankets. And
that's a good description.
Yeah. And I was walking down the sanctuary looking for a seat, and I hear people praying in tongues. And I remember being like, oh my God, that's it. That's a thing. They're doing the thing. But I had to like snap myself back into focus, being like, okay, you know what? Like, I have to remember why I'm here. Like, I can't get distracted by these things.
Yeah.
And what's so funny is that I take my seat and I'm in worship, and that night I never felt so connected to God. When I closed my eyes and I worshiped God, it felt like it was just me and him in that room. And I think I know that was one, it was, of course, it's because of the atmosphere that was there, but two, it was also because of the posture of my heart. And what's amazing was that made me come back the next week.
Yeah.
And so very much like this was a process of God like pulling me in.
Yeah.
And so that relational component I want to like highlight, because I think for us, like prophetic types, we're very dramatic.
Yeah.
And I think we could because of that, we have a dramatic expectation of God.
Yes.
And when that happens, we miss him in the small moments.
Come on.
And that's like the bread and butter of our prophetic archetype, which is that we could see God everywhere. And so I come back the next week, and I'm hungry. I'm like, oh man, this was such an amazing experience. I felt so close to God.
Yep.
And so now we're back, we're worshiping, and we had a guest minister at the time, and he led worship and gave a word. And so worship was incredible. And as he's giving the word, he shared his testimony. And he goes, yeah, so I have a friend who's spirit-filled. They love the Lord, tongue praying, prophesying. And they have kids that they're sending to a Presbyterian preschool. So I'm like, oh, this is hilarious. So, yeah, talk to me. And so he goes, so one day these kids, they're on the bus going to school, and they just do what they've always known, which is talking to God and praying in tongues. And so their classmate next to them asked them, hey, like, what are you doing? Like, very childlike,
Yep.
very curious. And he goes, I'm just talking to God. And so the kid next to him is like, oh, cool. Could I try? And so
I
like,
love
just
that.
like that, now the kid and the friend next to him is like praying in tongues.
Yeah.
And very soon, this is what's so hilarious. The entire school bus of preschool kids are now praying in tongues.
Oh my goodness.
And so this parent gets a phone call from the preschool, and they're thinking, oh no, like we're in trouble. Like we
Yeah.
went against their doctrine, da 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 da. And so the teacher goes, hey, I don't know what you're doing with your kids, but whatever it is, keep it up.
Oh, come on.
Because the kids have never been so amazing. Like they're just loving on each other, encouraging each other, and they're just getting along. And these are like preschool kids, they're chaotic.
Mm-hmm.
And so the parents was just, they're super relieved. But the minister, his call to action was to step out in faith like a child. And so we went back into a time of worship. And I remember like being in worship, and I remember saying to God, I'm like, God, like, I don't really know. I still don't know what tongues is.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if I want it, because I don't really see a use for it other than it's cool.
Yeah.
But I remember saying, God, if this brings me closer to you, then I want it.
Ooh, that dangerous prayer.
That dangerous prayer, you know it. And I prayed that prayer, and then nothing happened. And I'm like, okay, well, I mean, you know my heart. I wouldn't be mad if I didn't get it, because I still don't have an opinion about it.
Yeah.
I just know that I want it only if it brings me closer to you. And then I remember something that the minister said, and he said to step out in faith like a child. And so I remember consciously speaking gibberish. I knew it was gibberish. I knew it wasn't tongues, but I made a decision. You know what? I'm going to do my part. I'm going to step out and look like an absolute idiot. And so, and for me, it's like I hadn't been in the culture enough to know what good tongue sounds like.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I totally look like an idiot. And so I'm here with my eyes closed, talking gibberish. And then there was a moment when, the best way I could describe it, and you know how this feels, my mind unhinged from my tongue.
Ooh,
And I knew that I was praying in tongues.
come on.
And it was just on autopilot. It was just going and going and going. And that was powerful. But what began to happen was electricity just started to flood my body.
Oof, come on.
And my hands couldn't stay open. They started to close in. And then my entire body started to like close in on itself to where I had to like sit down. And so right then and there, I was just under the power of God, praying in tongues, having this encounter with God. And so that was the first time I felt the tangible presence of God in my body. And so what I love about that encounter for me personally was how relational God was with me and how he took delight in the posture of my heart.
Yep.
That beyond all of the externalities of what cool tongue sounds like, you know, what it's useful for, there was a beauty in like seeking God for God.
Yep.
That he took delight in, and he showed up and met me there.
Yeah.
And I'll say this, I think a lot of times like we seek God's hand and not his heart without realizing that when we encounter his heart, that's where the life is.
Oof, come on.
That's where the life is like he created everything from his heart. There was an overflow of life. There was something that he just couldn't contain. It was bursting out. It's his nature, right?
Yep.
He's ever expanding, he's eternal. And from that place is where life is created. All life is created from that place. And so we need an encounter with that.
Yes.
We need an
come
encounter
on.
with the heart of God.
Ooh, come on. I love this line that you said, Matt. And I hope you prophets caught it, because this line, honestly, this was the line for me. You said that because we're so dramatic as prophets, we expect God to be. But when we look through the word, I don't see this very loud and dramatic God. I mean, he did have a flair when he was trying to get the children of Israel's attentions. Like he had a little bit of flair because they weren't listening. But that's the key word. They weren't listening. And there are some of you who are watching and listening to this podcast, and you keep expecting God to show up in such a loud and profound way. And God's saying, why should I? You already know how to hear my voice. I'm not going to come at you with lightning and thunder. I'm not going to come at you with a ginormous burning bush like I had to do for Moses. He didn't hear my voice the way you do, but you already hear me. You already know who I am. So I am speaking to you. I am coming to you with that gentle spirit of creativity and life, and I am pouring life into your bosom that the word might flow up out of you and the wisdom and revelation may overflow from you so that you can then build and establish the work that I have given you to do, says the Lord. So press in to my presence. Don't go looking for the loud noise, but press into my presence and watch the overflow come. Now, that being said, we're talking about the spirit of creativity here.
Yeah.
And the spirit of creativity, I love how you said it started with worship. But it did not stop there. In fact, I would dare say the spirit of creativity begins in worship. It's like a jumpstart to our creativity and that spirit of life, because it is like the nucleus of who we are as prophets.
Yeah.
But this goes beyond. So can you tell us a little bit more about where that spirit of creativity evolved from you and where we as prophets can begin seeing it function and tap into it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when it comes to God, he is the all. He is the source of everything. So there's nothing that's been created in heaven or on earth that didn't find its origin from God.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
he's the only eternal being, right?
Yep.
So he was there before anything was created, the only one. So subsequently, everything that was created from him. Meaning that everything that created has an aspect of his nature.
Ooh, that's good.
Whether, I mean, even if it's like a narrow margin, it all reflects him. So that's why we read in Romans, right? Romans 1 says that the invisible attributes of God has been seen in creation since the very beginning.
Come on.
So it's like everything that was created embodies God. And so because of this, I think a lot of times there is a flow to God that we haven't fully realized, because we only associate intimacy with God when we get to connect with him face to face, without understanding that we get to encounter a different aspect of God when we actually express it from that place.
Ooh, come on.
So so if I were to rephrase that, having an encounter or connecting in intimacy with God is a receiving posture.
Okay, come on.
So when we assume that that's the only way we can experience God, when we receive, without realizing that once we receive, we have to put out, like export. We have to express.
Yep.
Express. And it's like the expression actually solidifies and it deepens the experience you just had in that intimate secret place.
Ooh, come on.
And so I think for us, like, we've kind of come into this consumer mentality where we're like, we only believe we're encountering God when we're receiving.
Oh, ouch. Yeah, come on.
But there's such beauty, because how else can we fellowship with the sufferings of Christ if we don't express? If we only receive. Can you imagine if Jesus did that?
Yeah.
Right? It's like if Jesus only loved to receive, and he never expressed. I mean, we'd all be condemned still.
Yeah,
right? We
true.
wouldn't be standing in this position of sonship. And so I think there's beauty in fellowshipping with the Lord as an expressive and not just a, how do I say it? Impressive.
Yes.
Right? Like being impressed. There's beauty in expressing. And so that's where creativity evolved for me. Was it started with worship, but then it evolved to expressing. That it's like, okay, what is it that I encountered? Right? God began speaking over me, my destiny, like who I am, right? What I'm called to do. And so now I'm receiving all these things in this place of encounter, but then it never became solidified and my creativity didn't evolve until I took steps like a child in faith, little by little, one step at a time, according to that encounter. And now all the things that I saw and I believed in the realm of the spirit became manifest and flesh and real in this sense.
Ooh, you spilling some deep secrets here. I'm like, I'm just gonna sit back and sit under the teacher's flow and receive. Let's talk about one of the most influential creatives in the Bible, okay? Solomon.
Yeah.
All right. Now a lot of people seem to think David was the most influential creative, and I do say he was a creative. I mean, you can't read through the Psalms and not say, "Wow, here is a creative." I mean, he was creative in the battlefield, the strategies, how he worked with people. But when we're talking about this receiving and then implementing, Solomon was the most influential. He receives the blueprint for the temple from his father David. Again, a powerful creative who put together this blueprint. But then he had to implement that blueprint. He had to go and source the materials. He had to go and source the master artisans that could bring together the stone, that would bring together the metal work and the working with the silk and all the different materials to establish this temple that's gone down in history as the most intricate piece of architecture known to man. And even he didn't stop there either. He allowed that spirit of creativity that he received from his father, but also from his heavenly father when he took the throne. We see him having this encounter with the Lord saying, God, I'm sacrificing all these things. He says, I'm well pleased with you. What do you want? He says, give me wisdom. Give me wisdom to rule and take care of your people. And he says, okay, let me give it to you in abundance. Here he takes this, he takes his blueprint, and now he begins building cities. He begins building castles and empires with the spirit of creativity. I mean, let's look at this influence and take from there. Where do we begin seeing this practical application? Because so far we've talked about worship. Yeah. But creativity can be found in many areas of our life.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's so beautiful about Solomon's conversation with the Lord was that the focal point of that dialogue was actually Solomon's heart to be able to be a worthy ruler for others. And I think that's the marked difference between a David and a Solomon, is that Solomon could now stand on the shoulders of his father David and take the spirit of creativity to another level. And I think if you actually read a lot of David's Psalms, he actually has a very first person view of everything, right? So it's all about him. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's just level one.
Yes.
And so a lot of his songs revolve around like his heartache, like his struggles, like his relationship with God. And it's beautiful because of that, we get a kind of glimpse into what an authentic relationship with God looks like. Yeah. But then your spirit of creativity then evolves. And so what's interesting is like David, he loved the presence of God. And so he did everything he could to bring the presence of God into the focal point of his rulership, right? Yeah. Beautiful. But what's so awesome about Solomon is that now he wanted to govern from that place so that the people he was ruling over could now also be a benefactor. And so now so David collects, right? He receives, he brings in, Solomon sends out, he establishes. Yes. And so I think that's the marked difference, is like when our creativity can evolve from creativity is just a means for me to experience God and self-actualize. And then we mature to a place of creativity is a way for me to express the nature of God in service of others. Our creativity will skyrocket.
Ooh, come on.
That's where the spirit of wisdom lands. That's where it wants to land. Yep. As we see in like God's relationship with Solomon and that conversation that he had. And so what's so amazing about that is that then creativity no longer becomes about what you do. It becomes about how you do it.
Ooh, come on.
And so when the how of creativity now one becomes focused on serving others, and it's about exporting or expressing as much of what's inside of me as possible, then we get to have fun because now everything can become a canvas for creativity, whether it's the way we do our schedules, whether is the way we do our personal finances, whether we can have meaningful conversations with other people. All of these things are now a canvas for creativity. And so what's amazing about that is like, okay, if the spirit of creativity truly is at its core the spirit of life,
Yep.
that means that if everything we do is creative, then everything we do can be infused with life.
Ooh, come on. Next Gen Prophets, you have been in a position that seems impossible to bring in the presence of God. So stop focusing on bringing the presence of God and focus on infusing life in your workplace, in your families, with the way you cook, the way you put together the scheduling, the way you mix the medications in the medical system, the way you schedule your boss if you're an executive assistant. You can infuse life in everything that you do. That is the power of the spirit of creativity that is inside you as a prophetic champion. And it's time we rise up to that next level of accountability and that next level of power. God is requiring you to walk in power today. And it's not going to come just through worship or leading worship. It's not going to come through always giving a prophetic word. It is going to come by allowing creativity to be infused in the work of your hands. This is God's purpose and God's promise for your life. And we're getting ready to wrap up this podcast. Otherwise, we will sit here all day. I know when we get together, poor Michael sits there watching this ping pong match happen as the revelation keeps downloading and bouncing off. So before we end off, I have 2 more questions for you, Matt.
Yes, love it.
Super easy questions. First, how can our podcast listeners continue to connect with you, to receive these downloads, and just be involved with the work that you are doing here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the easiest way is to connect with me on Instagram. That's probably the platform I'm most active on. And so on Instagram, you can find me at Matt Kim Official. And then you could also check out my website, mattkimofficial.com. And then my creative studio is the creative scene, scene.com.
And you can find all of that information in the show notes below. So be sure to check him out, follow up, get these tidbits, because I have browsed through his Instagram, and you guys, the tidbits and downloads are indeed powerful. So go and take those nuggets with you. My final question for you, Matt, since we're on our Next Gen Prophets podcast tour.
Yes.
What is one word of wisdom you would like to leave behind for the next generation of prophets?
Wow. If I could leave one word of wisdom for the Next Gen Prophets, it would be to learn how to honor. Learn how to honor. And the reason I say that is because we're so dramatic in our archetype, it's very easy for us to believe that we're the main characters. But the reality is that Jesus is the main character. And if that's true, then we are playing one piece, we're playing one role in generations of what God is doing in his family and in his kingdom. And so with that said, we have to learn how to honor, because that allows us to continue the storyline of what Jesus is doing without breaks. And so that allows us to have a lasting impact and a legacy, and one that Jesus is worthy of. And so I always say that honor is your ability to appreciate someone for who they are without getting hung up on who they're not.
Ooh.
And so every generation, we have our strengths and we have our deficiencies. But if we could stay connected to those who are above us and those who come after us and appreciate them for who they are, we're able to be complementary to each other and really pass the baton off in a way that glorifies Jesus and creates a lasting work in the earth. And so that would be my word of wisdom to you Next Gen Prophets.
And on that bombshell, ladies and gentlemen, it has been a pleasure sitting here, receiving these downloads, giving you guys this impartation. Make sure you are following us on our Facebook, our Instagram. Check out www.nextgenprophets.org. Sign up, reach out to us. We want to know your name. And most importantly, why don't you reach out and arrange for a one-on-one with Michael and I? Let us assess your destiny. Let us assess what is your creative potential and how can we release that into the earth. Let us give you the impartation you need to accelerate your prophetic destiny. This is your big sis signing out. Bye for now.